failure is essential to any practice, and you see a lot of that. So if you go into anybody's studio, I mean, in a sense they're not failures necessarily, but they're making headway towards something.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 61st episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Lime on Instagram and Facebook, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter with print news from around the world, all at pinecopperlime.com. We also have a Patreon page where, if you like this here little podcast and you want to throw us a couple dollars each month, you get very cool thank yous like stickers, buttons, and totes. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. Pine Copper Lime would like to announce that this episode is brought to you by our newest on-air sponsor, McLean's Printmaking Supplies, who've been dedicated to the art and artists of relief printmaking since 1979. Their small specialist team in the Pacific Northwest is the leading supplier of Japanese relief tools for printmakers in the US and abroad. Their primary purpose is to help you find the materials to support you to reach your printmaking goals. Our editor Timothy Pauschak's favorite tools are his Fatasu Ware Sankakuto 3mm V-gouge and his Josue Maruto 1mm U-gouge, both from McLean's. But you don't have to take our word for it. These tools truly do speak for themselves. So head on over to McLean's at imcleans.com to find your favorite tools and keep on carving. That's imcleans.com. And there'll be a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Pia Larsen. Pia is a Sydney-based artist whose work draws from her interest in people, place, language, and projects that engage history, culture, and geopolitics. Her practice encompasses print media, text, metal, and photography in images, sculpture, and installation environments. In this episode, we talk about growing up in Sydney, chatting with Trump supporters on interstate trains, and the project she is currently working on that examines the life of a woman she has titled I Am, who arrived in Australia in 1949 through Australia's mass resettlement scheme. She looks at I Am's life and experiences in relation to the discourses of gender, culture, and history. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare for a visit down under with Pia Larsen.
Hi Pia, how's it going?
I'm very well, thanks.
Good. Thank you for joining me. And actually in person, which is always exciting when I get to do an in-person Pine Copper Lime interview. Because you've come over here from Sydney, so not too far to good old Canberra. But yeah, I met you at Megalo during a reception there back in the before 4 times when we had reception. But I would love it if you could introduce yourself a little bit and just kind of give people a general who you are, where you're located, and what you do, generally speaking.
Okay. My name is Pia Larsen, and I'm an artist who lives in Sydney. And I've lived in inner Sydney, in the inner west, for over 20 years. But I was born and grew up around Middle Harbour, which is the kind of northern part of Sydney. And that was a very sort of carefree childhood. I went to school in a bushland setting up in Terry Hills. My parents are artists, and as are my grandparents on one side. So I took for granted an artistic and creative environment. And as a child of the 70s, the parenting was both very open and experimental, but with my parents it was also, there's actually a term for it, benign neglect. You were left to your own devices, and of course that's a sort of freedom, but For me, actually, over time, or at times, that became a bit of a burden because I had to make decisions for myself. And I thought, well, what do I know, you know?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it was a very rich childhood. And my father's Danish, so he migrated to Australia when he was 30, having met my mother in Denmark. And so there was that mix of a life in Australia through my mother, and then travelling back to Europe to visit the other half of my genetic ancestry. So that combination of being an Australian with a European background was interesting. A lot of art galleries, and just growing up in that milieu, bit of a bubble. And then I also was sent to progressive schooling, so no uniform, called teachers by their first name. It was that whole move into the...
I was going to say, gosh, that sounds like an American school.
Yeah, sort of child-centred and very respectful of children and their views, which was great. And then high school, and then thinking at the end of that, what was I going to do? I did have a bit of a sort of existential crisis, which was, well, life could be filled with lots of things or nothing, and it was all up to me. So that I, frightened myself doing that. But I did think art was something that I'd done for the end of my high school, and I'd made jewellery and done print, because my aunt's a printmaker. Went to Sydney College of the Arts in Sydney. There were a couple of options in Sydney at the time, but that's where I went, and studied printmaking there.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you tell that story of growing up in a bit of that bubble, because I think I had a bit of that bubble in my background. I went to just like a standard public school, not like maybe Montessori might be something about the way that kind of sounds a bit like what you're talking about, like the child-centric. But the town that I grew up in was extremely progressive, and it was the kind of place where, even in the 1990s, it was really common for, many kids in the class to refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and for the teacher to kind of be like, right, good on you. Where I'm sure there are places in the country, even in America, even now, where you wouldn't get that reaction. And, and again, very supportive, very, hippie, maybe for lack of a better term, that just progressive kind of alternate thinking. And when I left and kind of got out into the world, it was a bit of a cultural shock to realize that there are people who don't think that way, who don't privilege art, who don't have these progressive ideas. And I'm wondering if you experienced a bit of that when you kind of came out the other side as well, when you were saying you had a bit of the existential crisis.
Well, I think I understood that the world that I grew up in, the sort of networks of family and friends was different fairly early on, because where my parents live is a pretty conservative suburb, and it's become more so. So if you're interested in the wider world, which I was and still am, then you do come to understand that your name, Pia, even that was challenging for people at the time, not now. So it's that sort of adjustment where you want to be in the wider world, particularly as you're growing up, and in moving out to mix with other people, you then are challenged in what you have grown up with, but also then you appreciate what it was that you've had. And I think in a sense what we're doing is we're carrying those values as those people are transmitting those to us, so it's an exchange. So it's not saying that one is right. I think though a life in the visual arts, my parents were very fortunate, because that was a period in Australia where really a lot to do with Gough Whitlam, and it was a very exciting time culturally. That was when Australia started investing in culture and established the Australia Council and boards for the different art forms. And of course you imagine that these things are just going to keep building, but today Australia has really gone in reverse culturally, and we have a lot of political leadership that isn't interested and actually doesn't really seem to attach much value to the creative industries, as they're called, and even that's perhaps something that's problematic, calling it an industry.
Yeah.
It's interesting just to see, since I was young, what's happened and how much harder it's become in many ways. I mean, there is a much bigger creative community than there was then. So that's a wonderful thing. So it's not as if it's the same, but it's that thing where you still struggle to afford to be an artist, to find that the means to make art, and it's just the attitudes. You know, what's considered important in Australia. But for me, you go through stages, I think, as an artist where you question, well, if I didn't do this and if I did something else, what would that be? And I have always come back to absolutely realising that for me, it's very important being a creative person and being part of a community, absolutely. Perhaps because we've had to become much more aware of the economics of life. And so it just feels to me that the kind of politics of our time infiltrates everything. It's not just subject matter.
Right.
It's something we have to grapple with in order to exist and keep going.
Yeah, so you spoke a little bit in passing about having artists as parents. And I'd love to hear more about that experience, and particularly what it sounds like, you know, during a time where being an artist was like very fruitful and very exciting in Australia, and kind of just that experience for you and how you think it might influence your current practice.
I think the main thing is that they're jewellers, they're contemporary jewellers, and they have always had a studio at home. So the division between private and work was it was there, but you could see the workshop from the kitchen, and we were welcome in there. So we made things and fixed things and used the tools and that sort of thing. I have a brother, older brother. And I mean, it's a privilege in a way. It's a great thing to be able to watch people working and to grow up observing or just being together when people are working through their own creative ideas and seeing how that turns out in their work. So once I got to a certain age, my brother and I also helped our parents install exhibitions, and when we were young we were always taken around with them because they exhibited quite a lot in Europe and we were there too. So it felt very normal to have that sort of life. And the way they work, very much influenced by travel and place, and their practice has changed over time as well, but them responding to the physical environment and the built environment and the drawings they did. And also my grandmother, so that's my mother's mother, Margot Lewis, she's an abstract expressionist painter, and she died when I was 12. And in some ways I feel what she represented and the things that she had in her home, because she lived in a house up at Emu Plains that's now a regional gallery, and she was very broadly creative, and she made her own clothes and had them made, but she also painted the fabric, dyed them, and I remember she had these, my memory is that they were platform shoes, and she had actually painted. So everything in her life, her interiors, clothes, her paintings, she was working with as a creative outlet. And so what would happen is she would tell me to go and wash my hands, and then she would paint my fingernails. So this was our togetherness. Yeah. Because she was a very strong and slightly intimidating individual. Yeah. But a lot of colour. And I work with a lot of colour now. So that was interesting to think, you know, that's emerging now. Because when I was studying print, it was all black and white, and so that was the late 80s. And I remember thinking colour had its own sort of challenges, and really is something quite different to working in black and white. Yeah, so I suppose just being with them and them also being very encouraging of my own creative endeavours. And then I think also being in a household that had a lot of books, and so there were books about art and all sorts of things, but also just literature generally. So my parents were readers, So that was the other thing, is that I've always been a keen reader, and just thinking about that sort of world of ideas. They did sort of practice a certain sort of modernist ethos of working with ideas that they felt were their own, so not looking to art movements. And I think for me, when I was at art school, I think that was a little bit of a challenge, that in fact I needed to open myself up more. And I did, but then print at that time as well, and print in Sydney, and print as it was taught at Sydney College of the Arts, it was another sort of bubble. For me, in terms of the practice that I established for myself, I felt that I had to unteach myself some of those conventions. And the way I work serves me best if I think about it as images, and then I think about how is a print process going to serve that. So I made a lot of lithographs when I was at art school, few etchings, tried all the processes, and drawing was a very big part of my artistic output. But now, as the years have gone by, it's changed, I suppose, the manner in which I make imagery and work with imagery. So I still consider it drawing, but it's not the direct drawing necessarily with, a brush and touche and those sort of things. And also access to print studios.
Yeah.
That's always been an issue in Sydney, and so organising how I'm going to make my work. So I have a studio at home in the back garden, and I have all my past works and materials and things in that space, and it's wonderful. And then I have to be organised in order to think, okay, so I've done all this planning here and played around with imagery that I have here. Do I need to go to Officeworks and photocopy something up in scale, what have you, and then go to a print studio and actually then embrace that part of the process. So because play is a very important part of the process for me too. So there is planning, there are ideas, but then it's always about allowing the process to release what's going to happen.
Definitely. The question that came to mind is that a lot of people who I speak with who didn't necessarily come from an environment where they were in a studio growing up, a big learning curve for them when they get into their own studio is this idea about kind of failure and how it's a huge part of the artistic process.
Yes.
Did you feel like that was something that you had maybe a little bit of a leg up on in learning, seeing it, or is it still something you had to learn in your bones yourself with your own creative process?
Well, I don't think it was something I was conscious of learning from my parents, but I think failure is essential to any practice, and you see a lot of that. So if you go into anybody's studio, I mean, in a sense they're not failures necessarily, but they're making headway towards something. And so of course we've got all these sort of experiments around where there's a little glimmer and then you put it to the side or it develops into something else. I think for me, the thing about print and the way that I used it is that you've got, there's the paper, and then you've got all the time that you're putting into preparing the matrix. And in a sense, the place of play is something that I was reminded of as I got older. That was a bit lost, I think, when I was studying, because you're putting in so much time and energy to getting to that image. And so the way that I work now sort of brings those things together a bit more. So it's understanding that they all have a role to play in the work you make. And just to allow that failure may be part of it, and to have a number of things going at the same time as well. Yeah, because I think print can tighten you up.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, of course, this is a personal thing. For some people, it's obviously fine, but in a way, I needed to work for a number of years in order to understand what was it that I wanted to do. What did I want to get out of print? What was my imagery about? And that has changed quite a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think the subject matter in some ways has, but I think how I get there and how I use different processes, and also that when I was at art school there was a demarcation. between studios. And I remember thinking at the time, why? I did a sculpture minor and I really enjoyed it. And so that interdisciplinary practice, I think that's one of the great things about today.
Yeah, for sure. Because that's one of the questions I had to probably get to a little later on, is like that interplay between the sculpture work and the printmaking.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I'd love to talk a little bit about the meat and potatoes of your practice itself in terms of the subject matter. So like I mentioned before, I met you at Megalo and you'd done a residency there. And when you were there, you were doing work a lot kind of about the immigrant experience in Australia, and also, you know, the ways sort of gender plays into that, and politics and all these different kinds of things that I found really interesting. But I'd love to hear you sort of speak to it maybe kind of more broadly, because you said it sounds like you've been interested in these themes for a while, and then maybe we can kind of talk specifically about what you're working on currently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as we're talking, the show is being installed in Mildura.
Yes.
And so they keep sending me images and texts, and it's looking good. So that's exciting because it's been a 2-year project. Yeah, so my residency at Megalo was focused on this project, on the work for it, and the subject is a woman called M, and the reason that she's referred to as M is that if work is about a woman or has a woman as a focus, often it's the same in films. If you can identify that with it as a person, with the subject as a person, it tends to be diminished,
right,
into this sort of, it's a personal story about her life.
Yeah.
And although a lot of the subject matter and the events and things that happened that I've used in the work have come from her life, they are also things that women experience, and women of her era, because she came to adulthood in the 1950s. So it's a story that is applicable more broadly. And also I think anonymity was helpful for me, because I did notice that I was being overly careful, as if I had to, and of course I want to be mindful of material that's hers, but also then just to be as an artist, to just be able to play with that as well, to see where that takes me. And it is abstracted, so the works are quite abstract. They have a figure in there, but the figure is always veiled behind other layers and shapes and colours and things. So that's my issue. But she worked for my parents for 30 odd years, and one of her responsibilities was looking after me as a child. And so that's the personal connection, and we remained friends, she and I and my mother and brother, until she died in 2014. And I knew that she had migrated from Estonia, but I didn't really know a lot, and I have subsequently got to know one of her daughters and interviewed her, and so have got a much bigger story. But then it turned out that I looked up the National Archives, Australian National Archives, and because she came through a migration scheme post-Second World War to Australia, the actual ship and the journey they took, it's documented, and it's in the National Archives. So they're part of Australia's archival history, and their identity cards are in there as well. So I sought permission and was able to reproduce that. So it really is the personal and the bigger story of Australia, and because migration is Australia, that's the foundation of Australia. Yeah. I then had a lot of material that I could use. But she came to adulthood in the 1950s, and as we know, that was not a great era for women. After the sort of liberation of wartime, employment and opportunities, and
making their own money.
And then it was decided. The men. There's actually a work, I've called it "Men's Dreams," and it's about that the 1950s. pushed women back into the home,
Mm-hmm.
in essence.
Yeah.
And that their choices were very limited. And as a migrant, she arrives here as 17, been in a refugee camp in Germany. She comes with her father and mother and younger sister and older brother. And very quickly, well, part of the migration scheme was that you had to accept to work for 2 years anywhere the government sent you. So she and her brother came to Canberra, and she started working in domestic work as a cleaner. And she then met a fellow migrant, and they moved to Sydney. She then continued to work in low-paid work and had 9 children. And actually at a certain point over the ensuing years, she became a single parent. But just that period in the 1950s, you know, she starts having children, and women, I think it's hard for us to imagine the limitations on women, that you couldn't survive. I mean, how could you? Yes, you could work in low-paid work, but socially, there's sort of disapproval if you were to leave a marriage or live as a single person, and that women were, you know, they lost their jobs once they got married. So the idea that somehow, if she had wanted to, she could have had a different life, I question that. And that, hence the title, Dreams of Another Life, because I think she did have, as we all do, have dreams of a life that we would like, and then you have to deal with reality.
Yeah. I think about all the time this staggering difference that my life has being able to choose if and when to have children. Like, it's one of these things that you just take kind of for granted growing up, and then every once in a while the emotional reality of it hits me, that it's like, oh my gosh, like, because I'm turning 36 this year, and it's like I never had a kid by choice, and that was an option. Like, and then all the experiences that I had, you know, my adult life that would have been exceptionally changed if it had been like, well, you know, you're gonna have to get married, because if you're gonna be having sex, you're gonna be having children, and you need a guy in that situation to take care of you, because you can't really work. Like, it's mind-boggling that was the reality of people that I've met, you know, people like my grandmother, who, and she was an artist, and she, you know, before she got married, she had this life in San Francisco as an artist, and, you know, I just imagine it must have just been a beautiful time, you know, the 1940s San Francisco, I'm sure was just gorgeous, but yeah, it was these huge decisions, and it's not saying that women still don't make decisions about like motherhood and career now, because that certainly still exists, but not in the same way.
No.
That women,
and in a way, I think it's a good sign that we kind of have difficulty comprehending. That shows, in fact, how normalised it's become. That in fact we do have a lot more choices. But it is interesting, because I have 2 children, and certainly when I was pregnant, and because I wanted to keep on with my practice, and it's a challenge. And the people around you aren't always maybe they can't comprehend how difficult it is, because you really have to ask for help. And my child was in the pram, and I gave a talk at the University of Western Sydney, and it was about work and being a new mother, and one of the things I said was that it's really important to ask for help and not feel that there's something wrong with that. And apparently I got feedback later that there were a number of women in the audience who really appreciated that. But there was an older academic who attacked me. She was very angry, and she said, I did it, you know, this way, I got no help. And it's very interesting that I have noticed that I think that quite rightly I think for older women, sometimes they realise how hard they did it, but instead of celebrating the fact that women do have more choices. Their resentment then is fed into attacking younger women for their supposed privilege or luck or whatever it is. So yeah, so it is interesting. But then having children for me as well really crystallised some of those topics that we're talking about for women, and understanding the way that society perceives women, and particularly if you have children, and that's a box, and that I didn't necessarily feel that I fitted into that, and so that resistance is not always met with open arms.
Yes.
So I had an experience where I made work about breasts and breastfeeding, and I ended up showing it in the birth centre at King George V Hospital, and it was in a space that the midwives ran their workshops with, or courses with pregnant women, but it had been mooted to be as part of lactation week, and so the head of nursing and the head of lactation came to my house and looked at my work, and they were very polite. and then later on they said, "Oh no, there's no room for the work." And so this is where naivety is a good thing.
Yeah.
So I went, "Oh, okay, right." And so then I went to the birth centre, and then the head of the birth centre said, "Do you want to know what really happened?" And she said they didn't like your work, and they found it confronting because it wasn't beautiful images of women with child at breast.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I thought my work was, I think it is, it's a celebration of the body. It's not, but of course it didn't conform to the construct that they wanted to telegraph.
Yeah, it's, I don't actually have a lot of close friends who've had kids. I think part of it is coming from like a bit of that hippie town, a little bit where there's a lot of like, I'm not having one of those, the world's burning, kind of attitude. But so I don't have a lot of close friends. I have close female friends who've had children, but the ones I know who were close enough to have the honest conversations about, it's amazing to discover secondhand how sanitized the experience of pregnancy and breastfeeding is. And in sort of broader society, that it's this beautiful natural thing, and you always just look like you've just swallowed a bowling ball, and you're very comfortable, and and it's incredible to actually hear well, like my nipples are bleeding and I'm peeing myself all the time now. Which, and I think also because we don't see that side, it becomes shocking and then therefore seen as a negative. Whereas I think if you could shift the lens on it, it would be like, that is incredible. Like the things that your body has done and the things that your body is doing to sustain the life of a new human, that can be beautiful in and of itself as well. But because it's sort of like, you have to sort of shut that part of the corporeal experience away. So I love that idea that you were creating work that they found confronting, because maybe they should be confronted by it.
But it's interesting the things you're saying, because my partner said that when, recovery after the birth and so on, and he said he went into a room in the hospital and there were these three women who had just given birth but were watching another sort of harrowing, he found it, challenging, but they were really into watching the process again of birth and delivery and so on. So in a sense, I think women, particularly around that time when you give birth, we're totally into it. You just, because everything's new, particularly when it's your first child. And I just talked about it with people who'd come to the house, and I could see that it was confronting. But I think today it just has got better. Yeah, that conversation, that it's such a big thing psychologically, and the pressure on women to breastfeed, and that actually breastfeeding is not something that you necessarily take to really easily.
Right. Yeah.
And so we had a friend who was a midwife, and she'd seen her sister go through challenges, and so she said to me, this is what you need to do. You need to press the button each time and check that with the nurses that the attachment's right and so on, so that you get trained in a sense. So that whole experience then led into my master's study, and Foucault and discourses. And it was actually, I think I was describing something. I had a show. The show in the Birth Centre was called Time Measured, and it was all about time, but also that the constructs that define and confine women. And my partner said, you should read Foucault. So I did, and that he expounds on those very things of discourses defining who you are, and that then you take up those habits and define yourself in that, because we need discourses in order to understand where we are and what we're doing, but they also have that constraining element. And so that was really interesting, looking at my own work through that lens and doing that research. And Louise Bourgeois, and there's a British photographer, Jo Spence. I don't know if you've heard of her. She was fantastic, because she also was about the construction of photography and the use of photography to construct ideas of family and bodies and women and so on. So that was a very fruitful time, and out of that created a mammophone, which was a breast impression that I'd enlarged and etched into zinc, and then cut into this. It was cut like an LP, but it had a organic edge, and my brother converted a turntable. So it has a stylus, and the idea being is that these tunes that are played on women's bodies. So it had the slang terms, and then it had the maternal terms, the sort of side A and side B. So reconfiguring bodies and discourses through visual material, sculpture and print and paper. That's my
I love that.
Preoccupation.
That's so good. Yeah. I was thinking, kind of to circle back a little bit to M and the project you're working on. Yeah. Although it's great. I loved hearing how it kind of like fits into this, your sort of broader interest in that, the female experience and all of that. And so, so you're saying that, M, came to Australia under these really specific set of circumstances, which was, basically as a refugee, but with that agreement that she had to work, as you said, in some sort of, domestic capacity for a few years. And you wrote an article for Imprint where you talked about it a little bit more in depth. And it's interesting because it's, one of the phrases that came up in there was breed or perish or something like that, or
the populate or perish.
Populate or perish, yes.
So that was the term. I think might have Arthur Caldwell. Yes. And he, because what happened is that post the Second World War, you have Australians thought of themselves as British. They didn't actually call themselves Australian. So the attachment to Britain was that was the motherland. And that actually kept going. And so Australians at the time were resistant to foreigners coming. But what the government at the time recognised is that the Australian population was small, and that in order to protect Australia by having a bigger population, and also to build infrastructure and build the society in all sorts of ways, he saw an opportunity with these displaced people in Europe. And of course they became Australian citizens, but he used that term to sort of alarm the Australians here, is that we needed to grow the population or we would perish. So that's where that...
populate or perish.
Because, people had a lot of... There was, anti-Semitism. So there were limits on Jewish migrants who were able to come to Australia, and then later on the White Australia policy. So there were things that were part of Australia's attitude to allowing migrants into the country. And it just so happened that Em and her family and a lot of other migrants were young enough so they could be used as a, you know, they would be good for a labour force. And the words in the literature about just how they were described to Australians, so they were attractive. Well, and also that I visited Bongilla, the migrants referred to, called Bonagilla, because that fits within the way Europeans speak European language, but it's actually Bongilla, which is an indigenous word, and it means where waters meet. And that is the biggest migration centre in Australia, and that took in the bulk of migrants until in the 1970s. And when they came on a ship from Europe, they arrived in Fremantle, and then the ship arrived in Melbourne, and then a train took them out to Bongilla, which is just outside Albury, pretty remote. And there was, what you realise is how much marketing was used to reassure the Australians who were here, and to be the kind of conduit between the new, who they would be new Australians, and those who were already here, to make it seem that it was a positive, not a negative, because there was an arrangement with unions at the time that migrants wouldn't be given jobs that then could be reserved for the Australians who were here. Yeah. So, you know, it was a very kind of controlled thing, and marketing was a big part of that, hence those slogans. And then, of course, they kept adjusting things as the migrant groups changed, because, of course, there's one, when people who come from war, they had their own experiences, and then as the migrant groups changed over time, they came for different reasons. And of course it's about making a new life somewhere else. So Em and her family had fled because of the Soviet occupation of Estonia, and so there was no going back. So that idea that you come to an Anglo country and the challenges you face in all sorts of ways to start that new life, and language is another part of it, because she would have had, her schooling would have been very broken up, and yet, you know, she was 17 when she arrived, but she didn't get any more schooling, so that wasn't something that was provided. There were English lessons and rudimentary things in the migration centres, but it was always short, expected to be short, 6 or 7 weeks, and then you would be shipped off. So when I was working at Megalo for the residency, and I had brought with me 4 very large lino cuts that had been laser cut with images that I had cropped and prepared from the family archive, and one of them was from the identity card in Sydney, and then I worked on them further and then started printing with them. And one of the things I've been using for a while that's really come into play with this body of work is stenciling, but also blocking bits out with shapes of paper. So both making prints on torn bits of paper, and then I noticed how powerful that empty space was in the image. And so those 2 elements have become a much bigger part of my practice now. And I suppose for me as well is that you have the matrix, and then you've got those offsets, the prints, and there's a huge scope with the actual printing. And I really enjoy that play with printing over things, and just letting go of the preciousness and just going, no, I've got the paper. Don't think about how much it costs.
Yeah, that's the key.
And I remember one of my lecturers, even as an undergrad, saying, there's a point where you have to move to good paper, and you just have to accept that. And I thought, yeah, that's very good advice. That if we keep printing on butcher's paper, you know, we get very good prints, but they're rubbish. They're going to just fall to bits.
So I'm thinking about, because Em came here through this very specific sort of regimented program, it seems like there are a lot of ephemera from the archives, you know, things like ID card and that kind of thing. and other documents, which I'm guessing a lot of them are kind of in and of themselves prints.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And so I just thought that was an interesting element where you're taking these kind of functional prints, these prints with this very utilitarian purpose, and you're reproducing them and, as you said, layering them, and sometimes even covering up the essence of the information in the way that you're creating these different kind of elements of her life. And I guess I wonder if you'd ever kind of thought about that element of it as well as how it kind of weds into your prints, and then how, in a way, because your prints are so, like, as you said, kind of like tactile and cut up, if you think of them maybe almost more like your sculpture work as well, or if there's how that kind of relates to it just in terms of function and form.
I think one of the things for me working with imagery and text and information from archives, as you say, it has its own integrity. And one of the things I didn't want to do was just reproduce that history. So I didn't want it to be a nostalgic, set in aspx sort of, oh yes, we're looking at history now. I wanted to somehow bring someone's life and the things that affected it into the present, because those issues go on. They're still happening for refugees and migrants. I mean, and in fact, I think the issue today, the number of refugees around the world are equivalent to the millions who were displaced after the Second World War. So it's about kind of bringing those issues into the present. And I think too, it was about finding a way to work with those images, because they're very seductive. You know, they have the patina, they have a certain look, and it's very appealing. And I think that some of my strategies are to literally pull that apart in order to work out how to work with it. And if I think about the work that's in the exhibition, there is that combination of using elements of some of the photographs and then actually bringing stenciling and relief rolls and colour back in over them, you know, and the black and white as well, because that was most of the documents from in the archive, if not all of them really, are definitely the 40s and 50s and 60s. It is in black and white, and that does have its own kind of lovely quality. So it's about understanding the value of that. Sometimes if you want to make sure that it is situated in the right era, then you leave it alone. So it still needs to be black and white. So there's one of the works in the show is, it's actually, I scanned images of migrant camps from around Australia and then details from my own photographs from Bangilla, and then I've torn each of them and then actually cut apertures out of them and then attached them at different corners and created a shape that hangs on the wall, and it sits out, and then red twine is threading through the apertures, and then shadows are cast through these apertures and around those edges, and they needed to be black and white. But then there is a kind of synthesis that's going on in the process of handling these things, because I am cropping and enlarging. And one of the things I did a lot of for quite a number of the works, and the works that I used in Megalo, is that the images have been expanded, so you get those big dots that make the image.
Yeah.
So it's just teetering there where you have to be at a certain position in order for the focus to come. And I really love that idea that you go close and it's like oblivion. You know, that the sort of pixels, in a sense, or the elements have dissolved, and that's I see that as that we think of ourselves as these very intact things, but in fact we're kind of made up of a whole lot of particles that will dissolve.
Yeah, we were saying that we're intact things, but we're made up of a bunch of particles. When you were saying it, I was kind of thinking of the opposite, is that opposed of this sort of like internal, we're made up of these things. I was thinking of that expansiveness, about how, we don't really actually have like hard layers.
Yes.
Both in the quantum physics level, we don't, but also, we don't sort of socially, we don't economically,
yeah, that's
right. We have a very, very soft borders, if any borders
porous.
at all. We're very porous creatures. Yeah.
And I mean, I think COVID has shown that very much, which I think is a good thing. That I think a lot of the things that have been exposed to those who didn't want to accept it before, that disease, that that the capacity to share that
right
very readily, but it just shows how interconnected we are. And I think that's one of the things that drives my project, is that the way we structure socially and economically structure our societies, that's what divides people, that we are doing that. It's a constructed thing. And also thinking about the fact that, she worked for my parents, and that of course enabled them to get on with their practice. But that issue in itself about women in general working for other women and men to look after their children, and then if those women have children, who's looking after them?
Yeah.
So it's problematic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of it, comes from that dissolving of intergenerational housing and that kind of thing, where when we all lived in a village somewhere, some of those questions were answered, because it was, well, who can take care of my kids? Well, my mother, or maybe even her mother, and that kind of thing, or I need to go look for some berries right now, and Jane is already looking after 3 kids. I'll just pop, mine in there with hers, and that kind of really close-knit communities that we used to live in.
Yeah.
I think some of those questions were answered. Obviously, there were other things we couldn't get done in those settings, but yeah, that it's like we so recently have this rabid individuality built into our notion of self and our notion of success and our notion of a meaningful life. But all of that comes from just a place of extreme privilege, because it's in order to kind of get that, you need to be in a position where, to a certain extent, you can outsource child rearing or outsource, just domestic duties in some capacity. I think, and whether that's just daycare, or, being in a situation where it's safe and free to send your children to school, all of that is this privilege for us to end up on the other side of having what we've defined as like a meaningful life, right? Where you have this self-agency that you somehow fulfill in some way, and you have kids, and you have a partner, and you can have it all and lean in and all of that.
Well, I think actually that's a very interesting point, because I feel, my mother was a feminist, still is, and was of that generation that brought in those sort of changes. But what I feel is that, having been brought up in that milieu, is that there was an expectation that the change had taken place and that my generation were going to reap the benefits. So my political awareness was developed because actually that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
Of course it was in some ways, but particularly in the art world, it was pretty obvious that it was still, very much the archetype of the artist is still thought to be male, and it still is today.
Right.
Too. So I feel that what I like about our times, good things, are that it feels for the first time that there is a reckoning and an acceptance of inequality, of racism, of sexism, and the experience for many women of what it's like to be a woman, and that it isn't, it's not equal for all women, and that the economics that we construct and we live within, that is actually the biggest determinant.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, it's a really good thing, that there's less pretending that somehow things in fact were better than they are.
Yeah, and I think this reckoning too was sort of the early roots of feminism, and how specific it was, and how it meant, white educated women. That's who feminism was for. And really, of course leaving out women of color, of course leaving out trans women. And that now we're really looking back, you know, with less rose-colored glasses at those sort of at the early progress, but I think also, you know, understanding that it was a step forward, but you know, as you just said, the work is so not done.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And that it is something that people are talking about and really recognizing that it affects every system in which we navigate. And every system within the world, you know, just like education, housing, banking, all of it is a part of it. And that at least within, I was going to say, because it's sort of funny to talk about this way, because I want to say it seems to be like almost universally recognized, and when somebody says it, like it doesn't get shot down, you know, it's not like, oh, what are you talking about? But of course that's within a very specific circles, you know, it's within the arts, it's within progressive circles, and you know, there are still women who don't even want to use the word feminism to describe themselves, or feminists to describe themselves, because they think that, you know, it's you hear this like, well, I'm not a feminist, I don't hate men, you know, as if that's like sort of, if that's the way it's defined for them in their eyes, of course, which it's so much more complex than that.
But I think that's another thing too, is to then couch the term feminism in other terms, because of course that's what the critics of equality, that's what they've cleverly done, is that you demonize something, you simplify it, you make it seem to be about, you know, hating men, rather than women having equal opportunities, being able to, you know, have an autonomous life, to not be judged for the choices they're making. So if you talk to women and put to them and say, well, what, you don't want to have the opportunity to go to university or have a job or just have choices, and then they would, of course, I presume.
Yeah, really.
What do you talk? Yeah, what do you mean? So I think it's that conversations are often left at a very sort of simplistic level, and that you need to have it's a discussion where you actually need to say, well, what do you think that means? Because I think, fortunately, a lot of younger women have benefited from the changes in affluent countries and so on, and the idea of losing those things, that they quite rightly would find that very upsetting. So they need to understand that the loss is the potential's there.
Yeah,
and that's what's frightening. Is you know, I made an assumption that there were certain things that could never go backwards, and yet, you know, like in America, that women can't seek a termination in certain areas, and moves against access to that sort of healthcare, and you have groups in Australia who also go and harass women at clinics and so on and so forth, and it's shocking. But you realise that society is there are always going to be people who, for whatever reason, religious or otherwise, that if they have power, that they will exercise that. And you know, we have very conservative media, and so where we go, what voices are we listening to, and where do you hear those other voices? And that's another problem too, is that we are kind of living in these bubbles of opinions that reflect our own,
right?
And it's really important to be open to what else is going on, so you actually do understand the complexity, and also do be confronted with other opinions. Because I don't really want to just be with people who have the same views as me. It's good to talk to people and listen to how they see the world, and be challenged. Yeah,
and I think that to be able to take on that challenge without immediate anger and reaction, because I think that's when things shut things down. And one of my favorite people in the world to talk politics with is a friend I've had for 2 decades, who's a Republican. Yeah, just certainly not a Trump Republican. You know, he's a Republican who's like, Trump's ruining my party, but so basically he's not insane, is what I'm trying to say. So, but he's like, fiscally conservative, more similar to traditional Republican. And while I don't agree generally with a thing that he says, it's fascinating to debate with him. Yeah, because I think part of it is we have such a solid friendship foundation. You know, I was the best man at his wedding. You know, like we were very, very close. And so we don't have a fear of offending or of ruining a friendship, I think, over it. But anyway, I think it's, you know, it's so important to have people in your life who you can have the civil discussions with, because it keeps you questioning your own beliefs, which I think is good. And hopefully it lets you help them question theirs, you know?
Indeed. Well, when I was catching the train to Megalo, and I sat next to a tourist, an American woman, and we had a very interesting discussion about sports people taking the knee, because she didn't agree. She didn't feel that they should exercise that political view, and we had a very civilized discussion. and I asked her, because I thought, well, you know, I have my perspective from Australia, but what's hers? And so she felt that it was, well, she had an interesting take on it. She said she felt that they were employed, in a sense, to be sports people, that wasn't the place. And then she also said that she felt, what else were they doing in their lives with that platform that they had? So it was sort of saying, if it was consistent with their other actions, then, so whether that's a rationale, I'm not quite sure, but we certainly had a very interesting discussion and very open and genuine. It was like, well, what do you think? Why do you think that?
Yeah.
And I hesitated when she said she didn't think that they should do it, and I thought, no, I think I can have a civilized discussion. And I said, well, I don't agree with that. And actually, I listened to a very interesting discussion on Radio National a year ago or so, and it was about sports people. Should they use that platform? And one of them was saying, one of the people said, well, that there's a story about a couple, and you know, the husband says, oh, you know, you're going to get up and get the breakfast or something. The point being is that everything is political. So to imagine that you can somehow separate, sport, life, and then politics, it's no. And I thought, so
and I think also that the ability to sort of disengage with the political is a huge place of privilege. You know, in order to be like, oh, I doesn't need to be political. I don't get to be political. Why does everything have to be political? And it's like, well, if you don't have to worry about your teenage boy just being shot in the street randomly by a police officer, then yes, of course you can say, why would you want to get so ugly and political about it? If you can just live your life knowing that all the systems are in place to support you. You know, so it's I every time people are like, oh, why does it have to get political? I'm like, do you realize like how amazingly privileged you are to be able to disengage and not think about these things on a daily basis, to the point where you can get kind of annoyed by it.
Yes.
You know? Where politics can just be like a little mosquito in your ear. It's like, yeah, well, that's because you are safe within these systems.
Yeah.
You know?
I think also though that people, you know, they're not always comfortable, and also they're not. I don't think if you're not in the habit of talking about ideas and talking about your views, that I do feel that people are not confident. And it's a way of avoiding trying to articulate what your thoughts are, because it's only through discussion that you sometimes hear what you think yourself.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I mean, it's not I'm not saying that it excuses people, but I think the whole thing about talking about ideas, and also that there's the history that it's you know, you shouldn't talk about sex, you shouldn't talk about money, you shouldn't talk about politics. It's like, and you think, and why was that? What were those rules about? Because it is about people not being asked about their privilege sometimes. Sort of being safe in the knowledge that they can just carry on with whatever they're doing. Whereas if you say, well, how much do you earn? Right. It's like, well, is that necessarily a bad thing? Because in fact, it's shocking when people find out what their colleagues earn sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's very illustrative of, in fact, the sort of power structures and so on that are in play that you didn't know about.
Yeah.
And where you fit into the hierarchy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I want to just like dive into like all of my, you know, capitalist conspiracy theories at this point, but we can do that over lunch. So before we run out of recording time, I had a question for you, because I know that your work is about, you know, people and place and language, and these are, I feel like, in borders, and in this case, you know, immigration. And all of this has been affected by COVID-19 dramatically, like the words that we use. You know, I mean, our daily vernacular has been evolving. The way we travel has been evolving. Who is considered what part of what country, and what kind of benefits or lack thereof should they get. And it's been interesting for me as a non-Australia living in Australia. You know, like I'm not eligible for JobKeeper, you know, for instance, this sort of thing. So I feel like it must have been something on your mind, and it must be influencing your practice a bit, or maybe how you're thinking about what you're making, or maybe it's all too early to process, but it just seems like your practice specifically is really about some of the deepest things that we've seen change in the last 6 months. Yeah.
Well, as we've spoken about, I think that a lot of good things have come to the surface, and that Australia and other countries are actually grappling with the challenges of, well, really, there is no choice. You can't let, in Australia at least, the sense is you can't let the economy completely collapse. You have to support people. And so then that has brought out that bigger discussion about, what about the living wage? You know, how have we structured society? Who benefits from the current structures? So personally, COVID, you know, the lockdown, I mean, initial sort of fear and anxiety and too much reading of the news. But I think as an artist as well, I'm accustomed to being on my own and working in my studio, is that it allowed for that more. So I was able to just focus on things, and also because I was finishing this project, and fortunately the things that I relied on, one of the printers for the digital prints, I couldn't go to his studio anymore, and so everything had to be posted, but that was okay. So I didn't suffer in that sense, and was able to then focus on resolving things and the framing. So there was a sort of halt, but actually a rethinking of what I was doing. And one of the things too is that I think a lot of people did that, and on Instagram there were a number of galleries and artists who let go of projects and opened them up to other people. So I've actually participated in a number of things that have been about, one of them was a reflection on life under COVID, actually in fact 2 were. So it sort of changed the landscape in many ways. And I mean, in a sense, was your question partly about, were things in the project, can I see them at play now? Is that part of your question?
I think yeah. I mean, I think it's just sort of however you exactly wanted to interpret it, because I think I was wondering if you've had a shift at all in the way you've been thinking about these ideas, because while they always sort of brew underneath the surface, this has brought everything
it's true.
up. And so that can sometimes change perspectives or inspire or anything like that. So
well, it's given me a bit of a sense of urgency, and it's actually been good in the sense that it's made me feel like there's not time to waste. And that because things are changing so quickly. So one of the things I was part of was Australian Design Centre sent out a journal to 100 artists and designers to put down their thoughts and impressions and whatever we wanted over a 4-week period. And I don't keep a diary normally. I've got lots of workbooks. And so that was very interesting, because it was charting both what I was doing and what I was thinking. And then, of course, you read back in one's diary, and then you go, oh, right, you know, that's what was happening. So it feels like a greater consciousness about what's happening, and because I am interested in the news and I read the New Yorker, and I have a friend who lives in New York, and so I feel like there's information coming from lots of things.
Yeah.
And because this is a global issue, it's brought the world and people's experiences closer together, so I feel more connected. And I've also made work specifically about those reflections. So there's a work here, 2 works in Canberra. So it's sort of crystallised certain things. It's been energising. Yeah.
Good, thank you. So before we sign off entirely, can you let people know about your current exhibitions or any upcoming exhibitions, as much as we can plan for the future in this day and age, and then also where people can find you and see your work and all of that?
Okay. Well, the exhibition Dreams of Another Life at the Mildura Arts Centre will be up by the 23rd of July, and it'll be on until September 2020. And so Mildura is just across the border in Victoria, and the reason that I'm not there installing it is because of the lockdown between New South Wales and Victoria, because they've had a big outbreak. So that's a major thing for me. And then I'm hoping to tour that. And so what I need to do is organise documentation and then send that out to find other venues to show it around Australia. And then there's my website, which I'm pretty good at keeping up to date. And that's just www.myname. Instagram, that includes work and, as Instagram does stuff.
And is that just at Pia Larsen? At Pia
yes,
Larsen?
yes.
Okay.
It's at Pia Larsen Pia_Larsen 3 underscores.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll put a link in the show notes to it all as well, of course.
And then I have, submissions for next year, but as you say, it's an unknown, and I'm waiting to hear. And also I've been waiting for this exhibition to really come to fruition before I can turn my mind to making submissions. So there are things in the pipeline. There's work I want to make, but there's nothing I can share concretely.
Well, they can follow you on the socials to get to all that. So,
yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining me. It's always a delight to chat about everything. So yeah, thank you so much, and I'll just be in touch as the podcast's coming out and all of that. So.
Thank you, Miranda, for the invitation.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week with PCL's first repeat guest in our 2-year history. We'll be very happy to welcome back Ali Norman, who, since we last talked, has taken on a lithography studio and opened a community shop and creative learning space in Tampa, Florida, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So, believe me when I say, you won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.